Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind and unexpected introduction. Hello, everyone. Yeah, after the broad picture that was provided by Dieter Sturmer to you, I will focus on a rather narrow field of research ethics. I will explain a little bit what research ethics is, or at least what I take it to be, its main principles, concepts and arguments that have been developed during the past decades, and how it hopefully links to your day-to-day practice as researchers. So here is the outline. I will start talking a little bit about terminology, basically explaining again what I take research ethics to mean. Then I will say a little bit about ethical principles, but here I will be more or less redundant because you heard it before. And then the major part of my talk will be on these three elements, these three areas: scientific aims, research methods, and scientists as persons, if you want. Yeah, and I will conclude by giving a summary and a brief outlook. So, whenever you have a question, a comment, or something, just raise your hand. You disagree or something, so it's meant as open, so we don't have to have the discussion at the end. If you want, just get in. Okay, so I start with terminology. Much has been said in the first talk about science as a culture, and much can be said about science, of course. For my purpose, I take a rather rough definition, which was provided by the UK Science Council in 2009, and they said, well, science, that is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Probably not perfect, but usable, I would say. That is something we probably can more or less agree science to be. And if this is science, then research can be understood as the methodological and systematic search for new findings. So somehow it's very close, research, science. And so is research ethics and science ethics, though the term science ethics is pretty uncommon, I would say. So normally we talk about research ethics. I don't see much difference between both, but I will talk about research ethics mainly. So this is the first step in explaining what research ethics is. Now, from this definition, we have a rough understanding what science and research is. The second part then is what is ethics. So in order to explain this, I will introduce another concept, and this is the concept of morality. I know that in English these two words are mostly taken synonymously. In German that's also the case, but you can make a difference, and I think it does make sense to make a difference between the two. So I start with morality, and roughly again, morality is a set of principles, norms, or values for human conduct of general application. And here a couple of things are noteworthy to observe. The first is we're talking about norms or principles or values, whatever you want, whatever concept you prefer, for human conduct. So that's special about morality. We have norms for a lot of things in the world. For example, for paper sizes, you know, we have A4 paper size. That's a norm for paper sizes. And morality is not concerned with norms for paper sizes, but with human conduct. So we're talking about human conduct and morality, or about norms for human conduct. The other thing is what is meant by general application. That's somehow difficult wording. I haven't found a better one. What I want to distinguish morality from is mere rules of etiquette. Yeah? So we have plenty of rules which we more or less expect others to follow, but we do not really consider them to be moral rules, like dressing codes or so. So you may expect that a person dresses up for a certain occasion or so. And if he or she doesn't, we will somehow not really like it or so, but we wouldn't really sanction it in a hard way. And the rules that belong to morality are somehow harder. They're more important. They're strictly binding in a sense. That's difficult to get exactly right, but I think for the purpose today, let's just take morality to be a set of principles, norms, or values for human conduct of this special kind, of this hard binding type. Okay, so if this is what morality is, and we have, of course, I think everyone agrees that there are norms like this, that there is morality, then ethics is the scientific discipline dealing with morality. So morality is the object of ethics as a scientific discipline. Basically, like the brain is the object of neuroscience. So ethicists deal with morality in a scientific way. And we can do this in various ways. We can, for example, describe such systems of norms. And this is typically not done by philosophers. This is done, for example, by historians. They describe what kind of norms have been valid in an ancient society. They take this from ancient sources, they read it, they investigate, and then they find out, for example, that at a certain time in a certain culture, this was taken to be a moral norm. It might still be, or it might no longer be the case, but this descriptive way of looking at morality is one way of investigating morality. But as I said, it's normally not done by philosophers, by ethicists, but by historians or by anthropologists or so. They go to a foreign culture and they want to study and describe what kind of rules they follow. Okay. What philosophers are normally interested in is normative ethics. So not describing a set of norms, but rather justifying what would be a good set of norms, a consistent set of norms. So if we take this to be a good norm, then the other one doesn't fit. That's a typical thing an ethicist interested in normative ethics would deal with. So justifying, looking at consistency of the scope of morality, so all this. So what I call here on the slide a critique and justification of morality. And this is what probably most of you would understand if we talk about ethics. But there is also this descriptive part of ethics. And there's another part of ethics which is called meta-ethics. And this is concerned with the preconditions, with what has to be the case so that moral rules, norms can be there in the first place. So it's a more theoretical approach. It takes resources from ontology, from the philosophy of language, and applies it to ethics. So what is a norm? What kind of sentence is a norm? Or do we have to consider a specific moral ontology so that we can talk about values or not? So these abstract questions are dealt with in this branch of ethics that is normally called meta-ethics. Very interesting, but not for today. And finally, we have applied ethics, which is very close to normative ethics, in fact. It's also concerned with justifying and criticizing specific norms, but not on such an abstract level as normative ethics normally does, but on a more concrete level. So it looks at a specific area of human conduct and focuses on this particular area, and then asks, well, what kind of norms and values should we take to govern this area of human conduct? And research ethics then is simply one branch of applied ethics. It looks at a specific area of human conduct, namely science and research. So that is basically the line of reasoning or the way it fits together. So we can say we have various areas of applied ethics, thematically separated by different areas of human conduct, like medicine or business ethics or so. And we have research ethics. And research ethics then simply is the branch of applied ethics that aims to formulate and justify ethical rules and principles for science and research as a specific form of human conduct. Okay? So that's not too complicated, I guess. How do we do this then in applied ethics? Where do we start from, and how do we get these more specific norms, in particular for research? Well, we start with some principles that we commonly take to be valid, and Dieter Sturmer has already said quite a bit on it, so now I'm a little bit redundant. So when dealing with specific problems of applied ethics, we just take accepted ethical principles, those principles which we commonly share. You may not disagree with one of these principles on the list and then say, well, I don't take justice to be an accepted ethical principle. That's fair enough. Then you have to go to an ethics seminar. That's not a question for applied ethics anymore. Applied ethics starts at a certain point and takes some principles simply from the theory shelf, if you want. And these are, I would say, pretty good starting points. Human dignity, self-determination or autonomy, the protection of physical, psychophysical integrity. On the slides from Dieter Sturmer, it was called non-maleficence, so you do not harm. That seems to be a pretty accepted principle. Doesn't necessarily mean that you may never hurt someone. But then you're, of course, in need of justification. That's the idea of an ethical principle. It also, of course, doesn't mean that you may never interfere with the right to self-determination of someone. But prima facie, you are violating something. You may have good reasons for it, but then you have to provide justification for overruling it. So these principles are normally taken as accepted in applied ethics. There may be some more. It's not a fixed list, but these are good starting points. And in many handbooks, we will find either this list or a slightly different but very similar list. So it's not so important whether it's 4 or 5. It's important that we take these principles to be good, valid ethical principles. And then the challenge is to make them more specific so that they are interesting or helpful for the specific area of human conduct you're interested in, namely research. So what does it mean within research and science to follow these rules? How can they help us to overcome specific challenges or either detect specific challenges within the realm of science and research? So in one way, it's, as Dieter Sturmer just put it, making human rights practical. In some sense, these principles are very close to human rights. So you can say, how do we incorporate the basic notion of human rights into science and research? That's the idea of research ethics. And of course, we don't have a fixed hierarchy of values. We don't have a fixed hierarchy of norms and principles. And that was also already mentioned by Dieter Sturmer. So it's not the idea that we come to clear-cut solutions for each and every case. The first important step is to detect challenges. What might be ethically sensitive in research, in science. And then we can start to see, are there competing norms? Are there competing principles? What might be more weighty in this situation? Why? Because in some other situation we take it to be the same or something. So then we are in concrete reasoning over concrete cases, as has been shown by a deep brain stimulation or dementia, very concrete cases. So we won't get fixed solutions for each and everything, but on the other side, there is a pretty well-established societal consent about concrete rules that should govern research and science. So there's pretty much agreement. There's more agreement, I would say, than disagreement. Albeit there is, of course, disagreement too. But then it's this kind of reasonable disagreement. So we are disagreeing about specific ways of weighing one principle against the other, or how to make it more specific, but not the general approach. So that's basically my larger picture. Okay. Now, I will get into the details. And before doing so, I need to do some work of structuring. When it comes to human conduct, on a very abstract level, we can distinguish always between agents, means, and aims. So there's always one person doing something for some purpose. That's a very general structure of human action, if you want. And it does make sense, at least experience shows, that these structural elements, aims, means, and agents, can be helpful to make this field of research ethics, or other areas actually of applied ethics, a bit more easier to investigate. So what I will do in the following is I will look at scientific aims with my principles and background. I will look at research methods, again with my principles in the background. And finally, I will look at the agents, you, the scientists. So these three elements will serve somewhat as a structure for my making research ethics more concrete. So, and don't be irritated that I start backwards from the aims and then go to the agents. That was somehow more convenient for me. So far, everyone on board still? Yeah? Okay. Okay. When it comes to scientific aims, we can only say very, very vaguely what research ethics, or what kind of rules, or what we should and should not do in research and science. So the general question could be, which scientific aims are or are not ethically acceptable? That's the most abstract question you can ask. Yeah. If we look at aims with these ethical principles in the background, what should we investigate and what shouldn't we? That's the question about aims in science, and it's really difficult to answer, and probably only very vaguely. So here's a list of some things you could investigate. You could investigate, for example, late 18th century poetry. That's an honorable object of scientific investigation if you do literature research. Or you can do research on stochastic processes, or on cell differentiation, or on biological and chemical warfare agents, or you could investigate methods of torture. So I assume everyone in the room has an opinion about which kind of aims are ethically acceptable and which are not. So it's probably not something very secret if I say the first are pretty unproblematic, while the later are probably more problematic. The question is, why is that the case? Any idea what could be the why do we intuitively say, well, research of methods of torture, well, that's something we shouldn't probably do? At least the last aim seems necessarily to be against these principles, which I mentioned before as accepted principles. There's hardly a way you can imagine that it is compatible with accepting the principle of psychophysical integrity, of self-determination. So in no imaginable way, at least I cannot imagine, a way that you do this and at the same time you can reasonably say, yes, but I accept these principles as valid principles. In the first and the second case, there's hardly a case, or at least in the first case, there's hardly a case that you can think of where one of these principles is violated. So it's absolutely out of question. Yeah, you can do this. Whether it's interesting, whether we should spend money on it, that's a different question. Yeah, and how much money and so. But we cannot see an ethical conflict with the principles mentioned before. So this is a way of looking at aims. And as I said, we will only get a very rough orientation. Only very, very few aims in science are unacceptable under any conditions. So probably investigating torture could be one candidate. When it comes to biological and chemical warfare agents, many would probably say, well, that's also on the not to-do list. But some would disagree and say, yes, but to be prepared for attacks as a defensive strategy or something, that could be an argument, but still the need of justification would be really high. And cell differentiation, well, then it becomes really difficult. Stem cell research, what about the status of the embryo? So that's a mixed case. So there's no clear yes or no here. But that's a very an ethical view on research aims. So to summarize, I would say if no conflicts with fundamental ethical principles can be discerned, then the research aim is ethically unproblematic. So late 18th century poetry probably is the case. And the other extreme case is where conflicts necessarily will arise. Then it's simply unacceptable. And investigating methods of torture is probably a case in point. And all the others are in the big gray area in between, somehow, somewhere. And that's all I would say we can say about the aims at this abstract level. So when someone asks the question, well, is this aim of science ethically acceptable? In most of the cases, we will have to say yes. Perhaps under certain conditions. So only very few cases are unacceptable right away. Many will probably be totally unproblematic, and a large number will have certain limitations, seen as aims.
So for this initial categorization of your aims, and if they are in ethical conflict, you would always refer to those, let's say, 4 principles that you... But what about animal research? Because they're not included in that.
Okay. I come to this. Here I'm really talking about aims, what I am interested in, and not about methods. So normally, animals are taken as a method to investigate something else. So animals come into the picture right away, but as a method. So for example, if we go back, you might be interested in learning more about cells, and your aim is to understand something about cells, and the method you're using is animals. So in this section, I'm simply concerned with the question, is learning something about cells an acceptable aim? And I would say yes, probably, under certain conditions. And in a second, I will focus, but what methods can we employ for doing this? But that's a separate question. Okay? So another interesting question is, who is responsible? And what can we do to make sure that only those aims are being investigated who are ethically acceptable, and more important, that those who are really ethically unacceptable are not being investigated? So who is in charge? Who is the one who is responsible for making sure that this is the case? I have a number of suggestions. Well, starting with the individual scientist, each and every scientist, himself or herself, has to ask the question, is this thing I want to investigate ethically acceptable? And this is the first step. So the main responsibility, I would say, lies with the individual scientist. And he or she has to ask the question, is this okay what I'm doing? Or is it in conflict with one of the ethical principles that I do accept? But there are others. Research sponsors, and you all know they do these ethical investigations when you submit a proposal for funding. And one of the things they have to look for is whether there is something that on the level of the aims might be problematic. So it's also the responsibility of funders probably to say, well, you're suggesting to investigate methods of torture, but we are not giving money for it because we think it's, as an aim, unacceptable. Other scientific institutions, journals, for example, they may refuse to publish a study on methods of torture. That's also a way to show responsibility. Ethics committees, of course, and finally the legislator, but probably only in a very distant way. But it might be that certain aims of science are simply prohibited to investigate. So I would say the main responsibility for making sure that ethically unacceptable aims are not under investigation lies with the people who could do this. Okay, so let's now then move to research methods. There are two very hot issues in this part of research ethics which are being discussed for decades. Can you imagine which? Okay, one we already heard, research involving animals, and the other one, which is the other method that is ethically sensitive. Not enough coffee during the break. Yes, humans. So under which conditions is it allowed to use human beings? So strange enough, for some reason, today it's more contentious, the question whether animals should be used sometimes than humans. But that has partly to do with the fact, at least I would say, that the regime for using humans has been investigated and implemented very strictly, and there's almost a consensus, apart from minor challenges which still exist. And this is not the case with animals. But these are the two methods which are normally taken to be ethically sensitive. But there's a third one. What about research using the non-animal and inanimate nature? And I will only briefly discuss this because this is still not a very elaborated part of research ethics. Mainly I will focus on research with humans and research with animals. Historically, it has been the case that the question of research involving humans has very much fueled research ethics. So much of this list of principles, which we now take to be good ethical principles for the whole of applied ethics, actually come from the discussion about research involving humans. And this basically started around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. There has only been very few research involving human beings before, for different reasons, scientific reasons, religious reasons, institutional reasons. We have very few reports about research involving humans in the 18th century, but it really started in the late 19th century, partly because then these huge hospitals in large cities became established, and that was a resource to do investigations in a broader spectrum. And initially, physicians took it to be the case that as long as they do not harm their patients, that they are on the safe side in ethical terms. So, well, I decide what I apply. I'm the physician. As long as I do not harm them, that's fine. And that became under pressure, this view, as I said, from at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, and the principle of self-determination dropped in. As people started to complain, I was not asked whether I want to take part in a study or not, which was 20 years before very common. Nobody objected. It's the physician who decides. And then there have been legal cases in many countries. In Germany, there was a famous case going to the highest court in 1894, and there's a similar case in the US from 1912, where a highest court decision was taken that the principle of autonomy is important. So physicians have to ask their patients. So you see, another principle drops in and becomes relevant. Nevertheless, the story of research involving humans in the 20th century is a dark chapter of medicine, and you probably know about the experiments that have been conducted by Nazi physicians in concentration camps, and they were absolutely ignorant of, they didn't obey any of these ethical principles, although there were already regulations in force in Germany at that time. But that somehow fueled again the discussion about research involving humans, and as part of the doctor's trial, the part of the Nuremberg military tribunal where these physicians were accused, there was the court made a kind of a code, the so-called Nuremberg Code, and it started with this famous first sentence: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That was part of their decision that these rules should be followed whenever human research involving humans is done. So still, it took a couple of decades before a robust regime was implemented, and this is by now really the case. So we have basically 3 principles which are seen as mandatory for doing research in an ethical, acceptable way. This is informed consent, a proper risk-benefit analysis, and a fair selection of subjects. So under these conditions, the majority opinion says, well, under these conditions, when these conditions are obeyed, using humans as part of research is acceptable. So this is a way how these general principles are being specified. So the notion of self-determination gives rise to the idea of informed consent. And this principle of do not harm, psychophysical integrity, gives rise to do a proper risk-benefit analysis before, and do not do research with high-risk profiles. And finally, this principle of justice gives rise to the idea that a fair and proper selection of subjects should be done before. So don't just pick the poorest or pick those who cannot descend or something. So these 3 principles specify into concrete rules for doing research with humans. Okay? There are areas which are not so straightforward, which are more complicated, where in particular it's, for example, difficult to obtain informed consent. Think about research involving minors, or more closely to your area of research, research in dementia patients. You cannot ask for consent, how to deal with this. And there further specification has taken place. With minors, it's not so difficult. Normally, the parents are the ones who have to consent. But then it's a question from which age on do the children have to say a word on themselves, and how is it weighed against the decision of the parents. In dementia research, only recently the idea of advanced consent has been come up, so it's now in the German law, although it's not clear how it works in practice. So the idea is that people can give consent at an early stage of dementia, when they're in principle capable of making up their minds, and then they can decide at a later stage, I will be part in a research project. I'm accepting to take part. Equally difficult, but from a different perspective, are experiments in psychology. In particular, if some kind of telling not the truth to the participants is part of the research design. If you want to investigate certain types of behavior, you have to bring people into situations they do not really know what it is about. Otherwise, you don't learn something you want to learn. And that's really a complicated case, and there have been at least two very famous cases in the 60s and 70s which have provoked much discussion. You probably have heard about these, the so-called the Milgram Experiment and the Stanford Prison Experiment. In the Stanford Prison Experiment at University of Stanford, there were two groups simulating a prison. And the participants were told that it's about investigating the dynamics in a prison. And one group was a prisoner and the others were those watching at them. And in fact, the researchers were interested in how much violence the one group was willing to do against the other. And it ran totally out of control. So that gave rise to these more specific questions. How do we deal with these questions in psychological settings? And by now, the major scientific associations in psychology, for example, have issued specific guidelines on what is allowed, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, at what point of an experiment do you have to tell the truth, and all these kind of questions. So you see, there are tricky questions, although the general framework is well established. Okay, here's again a summary. So we have informed consent, we have risk-benefit analysis, and we have fair subject selection as specifications of these general ethical principles, which make up a framework for using humans in research in an acceptable way. Additionally, we have these more procedural safeguards, independent ethics committees, which basically are in charge for looking whether these material principles are being observed, and the principle of documentation and publication getting more and more important. For example, if you want to publish a study, it has to be registered before so that no double studies are undertaken. So you have to make sure that this specific study you're interested in has not been conducted elsewhere, because then it wouldn't make sense to use humans again, which is not strictly right. Questions of reproduction in science are hotly debated at present. Yeah, there is a kind of consensus which is not really satisfactory, I have to say. The consent is, or the general approach is, people shouldn't be paid for taking part in research. However, it's fair to compensate them for potential losses or something, inconveniences and so. In fact, it's paying. And in fact, it depends on where you come from, whether it's paying or only a compensation. And we still don't have a very good idea how to overcome this. In the 1960s, a philosopher has written a paper on human experimentation. I was really one of the first people from ethics at that time thinking about such a concrete question. And he suggested the principle should be the leaders of society, those who are very high in the social hierarchy, they should be those who take part in experiments, because they gain the most from it, and they're the least vulnerable. Yeah, in principle, that's a good idea, but it doesn't take place. Huh? So yeah, it's all over the world, it's the same. It's the medical students and people with, from a poor social background. And everyone's saying, yeah, but we're not paying them. we're only compensating them. But it's an unsolved problem. So and in almost all codes, it says you should not get paid for it. It's not something like a job you do. But the truth is, it is. Okay, then let's move to animal experimentations. Here the central question is, what is the moral status of animals? And there have been very different views about this in the history. Ranging from animals are soulless beings, almost similar to a table, or more similar to a table or to a chair than to a human. And because of this, from a moral point of view, absolutely uninteresting. So you don't have to care about what you do with an animal as much as you don't have to care about what you do with a table, because you don't have both don't have souls. So it doesn't make a difference. That's a radical view. Probably no one would subscribe to today any longer. However, for a very long time, a very, very strong primacy of the human was prevalent in ethical thinking. So it's human first. That was the dominant thinking, and in some areas of ethics, it's still. And actually, you can give reasons for this view. It's not as stupid as it sounds at the first view. And in the 19th century, a different line of thought appeared, and that was basically saying what counts from a moral point of view is not whether a being is a human or not, but what counts is, can it suffer? So the idea of suffering was the dominant idea. So when we look at something, or the interesting question we have to ask is, in what degree is it able to suffer? And then apparently at least higher animals are much closer to humans than to tables. So that was an idea famously brought forward by Jeremy Bentham and then John Stuart Mill. But in this formulation, the key question is, can they suffer, was brought up by Jeremy Bentham. And this gave rise to a strong tradition. Still, the question about the moral status of animal is not settled. And what we have agreed, I would say, is a kind of a pragmatic middle position. So yes, animals do count from a moral point of view, at least higher animals, probably not all animals in the same way, but at least higher animals. And one strong reason why they count is their capacity to suffer, but they do not count as much as humans normally. So in a direct comparison, it's still the dominant view, humans first. And you can test yourself, and I don't want to get an answer, but you can. One typical scenario is you have this burning house, you have the time to rescue exactly one being, either a child or a dog. Who do you go for? It's not a test, it's just a serious question. And if you say, well, I saved the child, the immediate question is, why the child? One answer is because in some way we think of them as morally prior. However, most Western countries at least have issued laws and regulations which give a specific moral status to animals. So it's not only because we don't like them seeing suffer, but it's for themselves. So they count as beings of a specific type. And then the difficult challenge in research ethics is to find balances, how to bring this middle position into research practice. So what does it mean for day-to-day practice? How many animals? What kind of animals? So at least there is a need of justification. So it's no longer the case that we can use animals just as we want, because we think they count for moral reasons. It's not as using stones or tables. But for good reasons, we can use them. So, and one established rule is the pretty famous 3R principle by Russell and Bert, already from 1959, and it's called the 3R principle. And they say we should replace experiments with animals whenever possible. We should refine them, and we should reduce them. And that seems to be a pretty good rule of thumb. The problem is that it's not implemented strictly. So we see numbers of animal use in science going up and up, although everyone subscribes to the 3R principle. So that's a kind of a contradiction a little bit. It has, of course, to do with more money and more people in the science business. But it shows the dilemma somehow. So again, I would say as a rule of thumb, it's really a good thing to think by designing an experiment, do I really need these animals? Do I really need as many animals as I thought in the first place? And then, then we see still numbers going up. There are other controversial issues, for example, research with primates. As you may know, research with great apes is forbidden in the EU, but not with primates. And even research with great apes is done elsewhere in the world. The reach of alternative methods is still controversial, so that's directly linked to replacement. So it's scientifically controversial how far replacement can be done. But from an ethical point of view, the least one can say is that more investigation in alternative methods should be done. So if we agree that animals do count, then we should try to reduce research with animals as much as possible. Okay, the point I wanted to make is I think that there's a kind of a consensus, a widely shared consensus that animals do count from a moral point of view. So we do grant them what might be called a moral status. And almost everyone seems to agree with this. And this is reflected in legal regulations like the Tierschutzgesetz or something, and even partly in constitutions. So animals are more and more often mentioned in constitutions as something worth of protection. Okay. And now I think the controversial point is how to balance the benefits of science against the suffering of animals. So if they wouldn't have a moral status in the first place, there wouldn't be a problem of balancing at all. But now there is a problem of balancing. So everyone says, yes, okay, I agree. Even most scientists, most scientists say, I do accept that we need to justify using animals, but I have good reasons. So I wouldn't really say it's only pragmatic. It's really a kind of a moral balancing. But there's disagreement about how weighty research should be and how much weight we should give to the suffering of animals. And that's the disagreement. And that's different kind of value hierarchies. And it's a little bit unfair, actually. It becomes even more tricky, because if you follow this line of thought, certain types of research are easier to justify when you're very close to, for example, getting a new drug on the market. You have apparently a much stronger justification. But if I do this, you will gain. You will have the benefit. While you do basic research, the distance to the benefit is much longer. But still, unless you do basic research, you will never get there. So, yeah, that's a tricky question. So one way of putting these 3R principles in practice and making it even more concrete is, of course, by talking about cage sizes, for example, or the need for certain procedures. And that makes research more and more complicated and more expensive, of course. On the other side, my main intention was to show you that there's a good reason behind this. So arguing about cage sizes is arguing about refining animal research, and this is somehow rooted in the idea that animals do count from a moral point of view. Of course, we have this tendency that some types of research are going in other countries. From a moral point of view, that's also always a problematic argument. You can always say, well, in other countries they do this and that. I don't really see that this is a convincing line of thought. Well, it's up to the individual scientist to decide how he balances it. And when it comes down to cage sizes, we have a kind of societal consent that this is the actual requirement we place on this type of research, and only under these very demanding conditions we are willing to accept it. And if you do not, then you have to go elsewhere. So, and it's a constant process of negotiation. So that's the way democratic societies deal with these things. Okay, so that's really still a very sensitive issue, and it's understandable why it's so sensitive, because animals do not speak for themselves. So people who are very opposed to using them normally see themselves as advocates of beings who are not able to speak for themselves, and that might partly explain the strong way in which they sometimes bring forward their arguments. And I think the best we can do from an ethical point of view is to make transparent the moral reasons on both sides. And then it's kind of a democratic process to find conditions which are acceptable for this moment. However, I would say transparency is important, so it's not entirely clear whether the need for making transparent why these large amount of animals is really needed. Sometimes one has the impression that it's kind of inner dynamic. So that was the experiment. Okay, now we do the next one. So, but if we take this line of thought serious, then it's really a serious question. Each and every time when we use animals, do we really need this? And that's, I think, what is demanded from an ethical point of view. Okay, then I move to my to the last part, doing research involving nature, so non-animal nature. It's not a very big topic within research ethics. Nevertheless, I think it's worth thinking about it for a while. The destruction of nature could be an ethical problem, even if no animals are there. And I have an example for you. You may, if you see it, you may perhaps not find it so absurd as it may appear at the first view. You probably know what this is. That is a test of an atomic bomb at Mururoa Atoll in the 1950s. And imagine no animal would have been there. Of course, there were animals. But think about the island only as being full of trees and plants and other things. No animals. Would it have been wrong to test this atomic bomb there? And arguably, one could say yes, because it does destroy a part of nature. So nature itself might be worth of protection might be in need of or might have a kind of a moral status itself. So when you destroy a large part of the Earth only out of scientific curiosity, I think it's not so absurd to say that there's a strong need of ethical justification. But that is normally left out in research ethics. It's focusing under this topic of methods on humans and animals. But I think one can make the case that it's not only humans and animals, but also the larger nature. Of course, normally our interventions are not as dramatic as here. And we may disagree here for other reasons. We may disagree because the aim itself was not ethically acceptable. But that's a different issue then. Simply about the method might be something worth thinking about. And then it comes, of course, to more difficult question. If we have an intuitive thinking that something is wrong here, why is it? Is it a utilitarian value of nature because it somehow interferes with our needs, because we cannot live there any longer because of radiation or something else? Or is it because of the aesthetic value of nature, because it was so beautiful and now it's destroyed and it's the destruction of beauty that is the problem? Or does nature have an intrinsic value? So that's something then we need to clarify. I leave this open here. And even one step further, I think one can make the case that even using artifacts in research might raise ethical questions. And that might seem even further strange, even more strange. Consider the case that you investigate an old book, and that's the last copy of the book. And it is really beautiful. It's 500 years ago, let's say 400 years ago, first edition of Shakespeare or something. And you want to know something about, I don't know, the making of the paper or something they used at that time. And the only way you can do this is partly destroy a page. Is this justified or not? So it might be that even artifacts are not, that we are in need of justification to use certain artifacts. And then again, of course, the question arises, why? Does this artifact have an intrinsic value, or is it just because others want to see it? So is it the aesthetic value? Is it violating someone else's rights? So that's complicated issues. But even using artifacts might raise ethical issues. And it's actually not as science fiction or as fiction as it may appear. A couple of years ago, they found these old scriptures from the Romans in this volcano area in Italy, and they were almost like stones, but it was paper originally. And it was not entirely clear whether it would be possible to unfold it again without destroying it. And there was no appropriate method at hand. So I think from a research ethics perspective, it was mandatory to keep it aside for a while and to think about it, whether one can come up with a method that does not destroy it. And unless you have such a method, you better don't do something, don't do anything. So there might be practical implications of this line of thinking. Yeah, then again my question, who's in charge? Just as in discussing the aims, one can ask the question, who's in charge when it comes to means, to methods? Again, I would say it starts with the individual researcher. So you, in your day-to-day practice, you have to think about, is using humans the appropriate method? Is my informed consent sheet really designed in a way that it puts people in the position to make a self-determined decision? Did I do a proper risk-benefit analysis? And also, when it comes to animals, did I really think hard about the 3 R's? Do I need these animals? Is this important? So this is something ethics demands of a researcher as researcher. And of course, research sponsors look on it, journals and scientific publishers look on it, professional societies, as I told you when it came to these psychological experiments, most professional societies have specific codes for doing research with humans or for doing research with animals, ethics committees, and of course the legislator. And a case in point is, for example, the German Stammzellgesetz, which is a legislator initiative to regulate certain types of methods, namely doing research on embryonic stem cells. Okay, so let's move on. I have to look a little bit at time. If you remember at the beginning, I said we have the 3 elements in human conduct: agents, means, and aims. And the final element, which I haven't touched on up to now, is the scientist as a person. So there are ethical issues about scientists just as being scientists, independent of the aims they're working on or the methods they're employing. And sometimes this is dealt under the topic of an ethos of research, special rules for those being in science. And the more convenient or the more pragmatic way of talking about it is good scientific practice. So what kind of rules do you have to follow just by being a scientist? And these rules have become pretty important, unfortunately, due to a number of scandals in recent years. So here's a famous case you may probably know, although it's almost 15 years ago. This Korean stem cell researcher, very famous, and finally it turned out it was all fake. It was all manipulated data. And this is apparently something you shouldn't do. It's not because of the methods, nor because of the aims. He did something wrong because he violated something that he should, that it is part of science itself. And an important distinction I want to introduce here is between misconduct in science and scientific misconduct. So imagine the following scenario. You have a coffee machine in the institute and it gets stolen. So we have a case of theft. It was a nice fancy coffee machine. It doesn't seem to have any strong relation to science. It was simply something that has been stolen, and it was pure coincidence that it was a scientific institute. It could have been stolen anywhere. And that is something what I would call misconduct in science. It could also be misconduct elsewhere. It's somebody did something wrong, taking something from someone else, and so. But there's something specific about science. If it was not a coffee machine, but a microscope, it still might be that it was some person from outside. He took something which seemed to be valuable. So it was not a coffee machine, but it was a microscope, and he's just going to sell it. That would still be a case of misconduct in science. He's just want to make money out of it. But imagine it could have been your colleague. And he didn't take the microscope because he wanted to sell it, but he did take the microscope to spoil your work. But because, for example, he knew that there's one postdoc position, and when you have the microscope, you will finish your PhD first, and then you will get the postdoc position and not he. And that's something different. And this is scientific misconduct. That is violating something intrinsically to science. And of course, it's still somehow a case of theft, but this is not what we take so serious about it. It's something that a scientist should not do, not because stealing is wrong, but because this kind of attitude is wrong in science. It should be competitive, but still somehow collaborative. So when you're in science, you somehow subscribe to a specific set of rules. And being honest, being truthfulness, not manipulating data, not spoiling the work of your colleague, belongs to this set of specific rules for science. And this comes now under the topic of good scientific practice, and professional societies, funding organizations have spent quite some work in recent years to come up with codes. And normally what you find in this is to work legal artists, documenting your results, being doubtful about your own work, maintaining strict honesty about the contribution of partners, cooperation, and so on and so on. What is a bit unfortunate is that very often it comes more under what you shouldn't do: plagiarism, falsification, fabrication. So that's rare cases, but this is what you shouldn't do. But what you should do is on the top of the slide. And this is somehow a specific normativity that applies to scientists just as being part of a certain profession. Similarity, there are similar rules or slightly different rules for journalists, for example. They have their specific ethos. Just by being a journalist, you have a certain type of normativity, perhaps something similar for physicians, but as a scientist, that might be, in a nutshell, what is this idea of ethos of science, good scientific practice, and that's a separate branch of research ethics. It has nothing to do with the aims, it has nothing to do with the methods, it has anything to do with whatever you do in science. You have to have these rules in mind. Be open, be critical, be cooperative, be honest. Okay, so we're all a little bit exhausted. The good news is I only have one more slide, I guess. Or two. Okay. No, that's a lie. That's, but not so many. Okay, you know already this slide, who's in charge. The individual scientist is always in charge for when it comes to good scientific practice. And in particular here, it's the individual responsibility of scientists to follow these rules, and even more, I would say, to be aware that being a scientist is something special. And with joining this system, you're somehow subscribing to a community normativity, something. It's not just like being in a business company, it's something special. And you don't have to, I mean, there are gray areas and you don't have to agree on each and every point, but at least the idea that being a scientist is being part of a scientific community that has its own rules is, I think, important. However, this idea of good scientific practice is really getting important for journals, for funding agencies. They put a pressure on it more than they did 10 years ago because of these scandals. So the scientific community itself is aware that it has to make sure that this intrinsic normativity has to live because of one important reason. Society grants science freedom and money, and it will only do so if science itself keeps clean and makes sure that not so many cases of fake science, plagiarism, falsification occur. So it's somehow in the best interest of the scientific community to make sure that everyone subscribes to these rules. Otherwise, society may at one point say, well, it's a mess, we're spending so much money, and all we get is fake science. So it's really not only for intrinsic normativity thinking, but also for keeping this free and well-funded science alive, that good scientific practice is important, and therefore publishers, special committees, the scientific community is so eager to make this an important and well-observed topic. Okay. So, here's my summary. Research ethics, as I understand it, is concerned with the specification of universal ethical norms and principles. So that was what I wanted to explain to you, that research ethics is a sub-branch of applied ethics. Issues arise in view of aims, methods, and scientists themselves. So that's a helpful way of structuring the field. In recent decades, research ethics has developed concepts that allow for an ethically acceptable research environment. Experiments show that these concepts are quite successful in their practical implementation. A fundamental skepticism of the efficacy of research ethics is not appropriate. So what I want to say here is all these rules and arguments, concepts like informed consent, like the 3R principle, like good scientific practice shows how effective it is. These are good arguments that have been developed over the time, and it makes science somehow stronger and better and more acceptable. So sometimes people say, well, these ethics, it's not useful anyway. Quite the other way around, it's true. Yeah? It shows how successful it is and how well it how well accepted it makes science for society as a whole. There are, of course, new developments, so research ethics will never be a finished story. We may come across new aims, new methods that we do not know by now, or we may have new detailed challenges like raw data and so on and so on. And we have to keep discussing these issues, ethicists, scientists, to develop better and more appropriate concepts to meet these challenges. Thank you for your attention.